All right. So let's jump in, folks, to what I call baby mania in our scriptures today. So we're continuing on in the story of Jacob. Last week, the trickster got tricked and he ended up having to marry 2 women when he just wanted to marry one. So any thoughts that were jangling around and reflections about what happened with Jacob last week in kind of the whole shindig of not getting what he signed up for?
He seems to get a lot of that.
Yeah.
You know, I after reflecting on the 7 years and you know, all of that, I was reflecting on your comment that 7 being kind of a euphemism for a long time. And that makes a lot more sense to me than literally 7 years and 14 years and so on. So I'm more comfortable with that idea than the literal reading of it.
So yeah, so we kind of cut off the story, not at the end of the chapter, but kind of at the end of the marriage drama. And so we're covering the tail end of chapter 29 and the first half of chapter 30. Once again, you can kind of see where the chapter breaks are kind of arbitrary because I wanted to save the next story for next time. And so what we see here is last week kind of wrapped up with saying Jacob loved Rachel and very much did not love Leah, even though he got married to Leah first. So just kind of remembering how kind of the timeline works. Jacob worked for 7 years, married Leah, spent a week being a husband, quote unquote, kind of the honeymoon week. And then after that, he got to marry Rachel kind of immediately, but was like set to work for another long period of time. So our story today kind of takes place in that chunk of time where Jacob's essentially an indentured servant for the next big chunk of time, but he does have 2 wives. And so he has to spend time with both of them, and both women want babies because they kind of want to, once again, we have a situation where children are a status symbol. It is the thing you're supposed to do as a wife. And it looks like God is meddling with fertility and kind of pulling the strings behind the scenes of who has children where. So any initial reflections before we kind of walk through the passage of this whole baby mania drama competition with the various wives, because Jacob ends up with more than just 2 women, he ends up with 4. Any thoughts or reflections? What was that?
I want to put in here that it just seems, I don't know what word to use, but it seems ironic isn't the word, but I'm going to use it. Ironic that both Rebecca and Rachel are barren, and yet they are the love of their husbands. I mean, obviously these men are very, very devoted to them, and it isn't from lack of opportunity they don't get pregnant. But both of them are barren, you know, until later in the story. But at this point, they're both struggling with their position in the hierarchy of the family, and children would certainly secure that. And yet all these sons are being born, and sons are very important. So that's kind of rattling around in my head.
Yeah, you see some of the echoes of the other stories because you have both Rebecca and Rachel struggling with fertility, but also Sarah did too. So this seems to be like a stamp of the primary matriarch that children aren't going to come easy, even though children are part of the covenant. So yeah, good observation there.
But why are they barren? Is it simply biology, or is this God running things?
That Right. Is this descriptive of a situation of like what God is doing and literally having a hand in the pot and stirring up and making drama? Or is this people who are having fertility issues ascribing explanations that made sense to them? Which is, I think, a question we can still ask in this day and age of where are we trying to find explanations in the world versus when do things just happen? So knowing that this is now round 3 with matriarch and patriarch and baby issues, what are some of the other echoes that we're already seeing? So we see that the initial barrenness of the primary matriarch, that's kind of already been echoing. Do we see other echoes of other stories that we've had? So this one pulls back in some of the narrative elements, not just of, you have elements of Rebecca, but you also have a lot of elements of Sarah, and specifically the dynamic with Sarah and Hagar. And I think that's good to keep in the back of your head, because this is almost Sarah and Hagar times 2 in a way. So there's a lot of other dynamics, which once again, the question is, are these cultural norms that are just coming back into play? Or is this the story kind of repeating and having a pattern and kind of playing out a script? So with that, let's go ahead and jump in at verse 31, where we see the kind of baby plot kickoff, where we are from verse 31 on, we see that at least the story itself very much ascribes agency with God in kind of deciding who's going to have children. So it opens with, God saw that Leah was unloved and opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So once again, a lot of information packed into one sentence. What dynamics do you specifically see here?
God interfering, first of all. No, he's not letting things gonna progress as nature would allow, but he's stirring the pot. Yeah.
Barry?
When the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, is that a reference to the fact that Jacob really, didn't want her? He wanted, so it's a reference that she is unloved by her husband. At least I interpret it that way.
Right.
Because then just a little bit later, after she has a child, it says that the Lord has heard that I am hated, which is a little more. And now again, is that a reference to Jacob?
Yeah. So,
well, he's a busy man for someone that hates his wife.
Yes.
Right. So let's describe.
Unless he gets him drunk and literally rapes him again. These women getting the men drunk and having their way with them seems to be a theme as well.
So here are some dynamics to talk about right at the beginning. So the fact that the Lord opens her womb, that first description kind of assumes that you are barren unless God chooses you to have children.
Yeah.
Or at least the matriarchal women. I don't know if this was a universal assumption that if you have children, God is opening up. It is a direct gift. But there seems to be this kind of assumption that if God had not blessed Leah, both pronunciations are accurate to a certain point. So with Leah, if God had not chosen for her womb to be open, it sounds like she wouldn't have kids.
Right.
And so God seems to be responding to the fact of how Jacob is treating the two women. Now, this information is assumptions from kind of various anthropological studies. Some of this is kind of talked about actually because of Islamic tradition. So a lot is recorded about kind of cultural norms, and the Prophet Muhammad talks about some things in depth that are more culturally related that kind of get archived through some of the writings. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about that culture, but it's assumed that because his words were written down, that this might be some cultural things that were common at this time that were just preserved differently, if that makes sense.
Okay.
So one of the things that is discussed in Muhammad's writings, I do not believe it's the Quran. There's a bunch of other writings that are also preserved, is what to do when you have multiple wives. And one of the things that is very clear is that you have designated time with each of them. And that's kind of standard, where the man has his tent, the women have their tents, because remember, they're still kind of nomadic. And so the women are given their own tents. And so the man has like designated times to spend with each one of them. And he kind of has husbandly duties that he has to fulfill, whether or not he likes the person he's fulfilling it with.
Wow.
And so when it's talking, because I figured this might be a confusion, if Jacob doesn't love Leah, how are they getting it on? Because you kind of need some human interaction for babies to happen.
Yeah.
So the kind of underlying assumption that we see preserved in the Islamic tradition is, it talks about it specifically that in cultures with more than one wife, you see them have arrangements of like, so you get him for Monday and Tuesday, I get him for Wednesday and Thursday, Friday he gets a day off, and they kind of have this arrangement where he goes around. So he is still fulfilling husbandly duties to Leah, it seems. But this is really talking about Jacob's emotional state. He is taking care of them, but you can take care of someone and not treat them nicely at the same time.
Mhm.
So does that clarify a little bit of the dynamics here?
Mhm.
Yeah. I just an aside,
Mhm.
the Eastern whatever of having concubines, that one of the things I read, it was the husband, or I'm sorry, to have multiple wives. It was the husband's obligation to give a child to each.
Mhm.
So it's a thread through the cultures, the different cultures.
Right. Exactly. And so one of the things that gets talked about sometimes is don't take on more wives than you can treat equally.
Mhm.
And that becomes like a moral standing, that it's like, if you can really only give your time and attention to two wives, don't take on a third. Don't ignore one of them. And some of it is, there's kind of a hope that they're of equal status if you have more than one. And part of that is kids. Can you actually give kids to all of them? Because kids, especially when you're talking about multiple wives, it's not just status in that, like, look at the abundance God has given me. That's your social security. If the husband dies and you have one wife without kids and one wife with kids, those kids of the other wife are not obliged to care for the childless wife. And that gets you in a very precarious situation. So children are your social security network, especially sons, but like most specifically sons. And so we see Leah very much straight out of the gate gets a very big social support network. She gets son after son after son. And each time she bears a son, she has you see all the women, they give little speeches It's because all of these names have meanings, and the kind of the description is the meaning of the name, if that makes sense. So this is all puns. So the first to be born is Reuben, which means Leah, the eldest, also has the eldest son of Jacob, which means firstborn status goes to Reuben. Just knowing where the story goes, remember Reuben. So we're going to get to Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat. And it's always good to know who the firstborn is and who kind of some of the major actors are and who's the son of who, because it does come into play. So remember Reuben, he is the oldest. And we don't really have time gaps of like how many years are between each one, but it sounds like Leah kind of has one after the other. So they're probably closer in age. But Leah's hope is that, I am the first wife to bear a son. My first child is a son. Now my husband will love me. Did it work?
No.
They all understand that she is not his favorite.
Right. And yet she's trying to earn her way to be his favorite.
At least
Or
in staff.
at least rise above being hated, you know, soften the relationship as much as she can. You know, come see me more often to see your sons. Anyway, I just got a text message come in on my phone. It's like, I got too much technology happening here.
So this is, I do think that Leah's response and kind of Leah's continued response actually gives an interesting window into Jacob. What is Jacob valuing in this situation? If Leah can have the most prestigious thing she can have as a woman, she immediately gets pregnant, immediately has the firstborn child, is the first wife, and has a son. Like, she did everything right, and yet she isn't valued. So what does that say about Jacob here?
He's devoted to Rachel.
Yeah, he hasn't changed his mind.
So he is, even though there's like a whole covenant that's around babies, it seems like he in some ways just has I don't want to like put too much on him, but like he genuinely loves Rachel for something other than what she can give him, is at least my assumption.
Yeah, because she hasn't had any children.
Right. And so have you, yeah, go for it.
I would say he probably feels trapped.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I draw this out because I'm curious if we see this in our own lives, where there's a situation where we're trying to win someone's approval, we're trying to win someone's affection, and we're doing everything right. Or if you've seen someone else do it, where it's like, I don't understand why this person doesn't like me. Like for all intents and purposes, I should be liked. I did everything right. And yet you can't, there isn't attention or affection to be earned or approval. I'm curious if you've seen this kind of a situation. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Yeah. One of my mother's constant sayings when I was growing up was kill them with kindness. That when people didn't like me or were mean to me or, you know, just drove with things, her response was kill them with kindness. And it was so hard to do. But I had the reverse happen to me as an adult, where there was just a woman that I just didn't want any part of. And she started killing me with kindness. And man, that just rankled, but I knew exactly what was happening and, kind of softened my stance. But my mother's saying comes right to mind in this scenario. So,
Mhm. Any other thoughts or reflections on this? I know for me, my hard lesson was there was often people that I tried to be friends with, and it took me a long time to learn. Don't try to be friends with people who don't want to be friends with you. If you're always the one like initiating and trying to like put yourself out there, at a certain point, you kind of notice the silence. And I think it's harder when like Leah's locked in a marriage here, but it's hard when you're trying to win affection from someone who isn't going to give it.
Yeah.
it's hard to be the other person and know what's going on too.
Mhm.
We have that situation around here. And there are people who are lonely and really are reaching out to try and make friends, but their personality doesn't click with the group culture. And you can see them trying so hard and, with anybody, and nobody's responding. But yet when it is turned toward me, it's very, very awkward because I don't want to respond. I don't want to be her go-to person. The first person who's nice, she's going to latch on to, and you're going to have her forever. So it's very hard to be on the other side too.
It is. Yeah.
But
Larry?
it appears this group of people are locked into their situation. There's no freedom of choice here. They're all fulfilling certain roles and they have to keep doing it. And they can't really change their behavior, really.
Or their status.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. There's almost a point where you're like, where I was thinking in this story of like, what could be done to like change the dynamic here? And I feel like one of the things is like, it's hard, but it's like at a certain point, if you're locked into a system and there's like some of this dynamic is happening, it seems like the person with the most agency is like, Leah, stop caring. And it sucks. It's like not a fun thing, but it's like there is something that has to give or has to change. But instead, they just have a foot race with babies. And so from 31 to the end of the chapter, Leah gets 4 kids straight away, just one after another. It goes from maybe my husband will love me. Now my husband will be joined to me because I have 3 sons, Levi, but it kind of ends at verse 35 with, this time I will praise the Lord. Therefore she named Judah, and for the time she ceased bearing. What's up?
And God meddles again, and she becomes barren at this point. It cuts off what, it's like, okay, 4 sons and you're done. And the scenario will continue from here. God's interfering a lot with the fertility of these women. Oh, lost you. Oh, okay. I thought for a minute I lost your audio. Okay.
Oh, the heater kicked on, and so I was worried it was giving feedback.
Okay.
So yeah, God kind of steps in, and God's like, okay, 4's enough for now. We're gonna cut you off here. But then we get Rachel's side of things, and we get in chapter 30, no children, and she envied her sister. And so we get the other side where each one has the thing that the other wants. Rachel has the love of her husband and evidently his undying affection, but she has no kids. Her sister has all the kids, but no affection.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And what she does then is lash out at Jacob. So we see in verse 2, where she becomes angry with Jacob because evidently it's his fault, when it's very
Yes.
clear that he's not the infertile one. He is very fertile, it looks like.
Mhm.
And his response is, am I in the place of God who has withheld you the fruit of your womb?
Yes.
So how does this response compare to how Abraham responded to Sarah when Sarah was getting frustrated with children?
My memory of Abraham, and that was a long time ago, we talked about this. My memory of Abraham was that he continued to be very supportive and loving with his wife. And I don't remember any of this blame game happening between them. Am I
Mhm.
just faulty memory or? No, okay.
No, yeah. So for the most part, Abraham, when it came to like these dynamics, he was either supportive or he just kind of like backed away. He didn't say much.
Well, that's
Um,
right. He just kind of let it be and walked away. And he was, yeah, I remember that.
mhm. And so by contrast, Jacob is a little bit more active here in that he is like, this isn't my problem, talk to God kind of a thing. Take your issue up with God. I am not the one withholding things from you, which sounds like he is doing his husbandly duty.
Mhm.
And so she does what Sarah does,
Yes.
to a different effect though.
Uh-huh.
Sarah gave Hagar and then immediately hated the results. Rachel gives Bilhah as a wife. So once again, like, in my place, sleep with my handmaiden. And Bilhah conceives and bears a son immediately. But rather than resentful, she her response is then verse 6, God has judged me and has also heard my voice and given me a son. And so she sees, or I mean, kind of in the ancient custom, this son is seen as hers, and unlike Hagar, who kind of assumed an elevated status, it sounds like Bilhah is still kind of just a surrogate wife.
Mhm. Yeah. Because she names the child,
Mm-hmm.
not the birth mother doesn't name the child. She names the child.
Exactly. And so the word or the name Dan is associated with the verb to judge. And so Dan is kind of seen as like the judge. Some of these names will carry over, because if you haven't caught on by now, the 12 kids that are going to be born are the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. So this is how we get 12 tribes, and the naming conventions and kind of the explanation of why different tribes are named different things. And so Dan is the judge in a way. But then Rachel's maid conceives again, and that name, which I don't know how to pronounce, is talking about wrestling. So she's still kind of wrestling with this. She knows someone's bearing children on her behalf, but now she at least has 2 children to her credit in a way. So what do you think of this? Of like, her solution is kind of the same as Sarah's solution, but it goes a little bit better. What do you all think?
Well, the women are different too, between Hagar and I forget the Bilhah. The nature of the women have to be very different as well. Because this servant maid, whatever, doesn't seem to protest giving up her children. And Hagar reacted completely differently. And so that's what I think.
Mhm.
I don't know how to stop.
But of course, Sarah didn't claim Hagar's child as hers, whereas Rachel is claiming these children. I mean, she's naming them and she's saying, it's my son. And, you know,
Right. So I think it's interesting to think about the difference in status between Sarah and between Leah and Rachel. So Sarah both was older, where it sounds like Leah and Rachel are still fairly young.
Mhm.
The other thing is Sarah was the matriarch and kind of the female business owner of Abraham, who is like this mighty dude, and she is at the helm of the ship here. Leah and Rachel are not at this point. They have not reached that matriarch status, that full matriarch status, because they're still kind of living at home with dad. So their dad is technically the patriarch, and it never mentions their mother, but she would be in the place of the matriarch or whatever female thing. So they're not actually at the same high status as Sarah at this point. They're actually a rung or two down still, because they're still the rich guy's daughters. They are not yet matriarchs themselves. So does that dynamic, you think, change a little bit? There's also a fairly good chance that they grew up with these two maids, whether it's like kind of a lady in waiting status where they're kind of similar ages, they might be slightly older, but it's likelihood that these are two rich girls who grew up with their like servant handmaid and kind of have a different relationship than maybe Sarah had with Hagar, which we kind of don't know the long-term status of. It almost sounded like they picked up Hagar partway through their journeys, where it's more likely that they grew up either with handmaids or with these two specifically.
That resounds with me in that two sisters growing up, and there were three of us. There's some rivalry that goes on in your growing up years, and there's a lot of conflict, and not a lot, but conflict, and you're looking for your parents' approval, and sometimes some maneuvers that aren't particularly honorable, but they're children and they're growing up with this kind of a history, so they're bringing that to the marriage. And you mentioned that they are rich young girls. They're feeling entitled, and they're struggling for the position of matriarch. Who's it going to be? And one has the love of Jacob, the other has the children, and so it's an ongoing struggle for the status for the future. I mean, who's going to be, the woman in charge, and who will be subservient to her? Well, this is playing around during this time.
Yeah, I love how you kind of expanded the image of, that I think that's a good way to like think about it. So, but of course, when one sister has something and the other, or going back and forth, it just feels like they're ramping the situation up. And so since Rachel gave her handmaid, Leah says, well, I have a handmaid, let's throw her into the mix. And so Leah throws in Zilpah, and Zilpah once again gets pregnant immediately. So now there is 4 women, and Jacob has to make the rounds of all 4 women in a certain amount of time and give husbandly duty to them all. And Leah seems, I don't know about you all, but from her responses, how they slowly change, it sounds like she does kind of start to give up on the affections of Jacob, and it's just like, look at me, I have the status, I have the kids, happy am I, for women will call me happy. And so she names him Asher. And so she starts trying to get the approval of the other women, like, give up on Jacob, I don't care about him, let's look for the approval of the other women. So by verse 14, we see a fascinating kind of scenario start to play out.
Yeah.
So Reuben, remember Reuben? He's the eldest.
Number 1.
He finds some mandrake roots. So notably, mandrake was seen in the ancient world as both something that increases fertility and was assumed to be an aphrodisiac. And so Reuben, the firstborn, Leah's son, gets these mandrakes, and Rachel's like, can I have them, please? Please, desperately, sister, give me those mandrakes. And so the swap is, I'll give you my son's mandrakes, but I get your night with Jacob, which is where you see there's very much a rotation that Jacob's going through. And so she gets the aphrodisiac and the fertility treatment, but she doesn't get Jacob for the night.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the result, Leah's very open. I have hired you for the night. I have sold your services for some mandrake roots. And Leah conceives once again. So this is kind of ironic that Rachel is desperate for fertility, and yet she sells it for Jacob's time, and Jacob's time ends up being the thing that brought, like, once again, Leah conceives once again. So what do you think of this little snippet of a scenario? Yeah.
Wait a minute. Hasn't Rachel already taken away Leah's husband? I mean,
He's now
that was
doing.
in the. I mean, it didn't sound like they were trading the mandrakes for one more night, you know, because, you know, Leah was married to Jacob first, and Rachel took him away from her already.
Mm-hmm.
So I didn't get that reference that
Okay.
lie with you tonight. Okay. Okay. Well, who's gonna go lie with Leah? Is it the son? Is it Reuben?
No, it's Jacob.
Jacob.
Yeah.
You know, the poor men get tossed around here like they're just useful tools to get
Yes.
to keep the story going.
Mm-hmm. Right. So you took my husband away. At least a lot of the commentators are saying, like, this is like emotionally you took him away. I have to share him.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to share him, but you made me share him. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to trade you your night of the week for these mandrake roots.
Okay. All right. Got to.
But the thing is, it's an interesting thought, because it does come with the, like, chop chop. All right, husband, you have to do the husbandly duties. I paid mandrakes for this.
Yeah.
So yeah, by verse 17, God heeded Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son.
The son. Yeah.
So God
Okay.
listened to Leah, even though Rachel bought the mandrake roots. God didn't listen to Rachel there.
Is Larry okay?
I think
Is
he's
Larry
just
okay?
leaning forward and reading.
Okay.
She was asking if you were okay, Larry.
Oh, yes, I was trying to keep my place in this complicated story.
Okay.
It's hard to keep track of who's pulling the strings here.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jacob's in charge of everything except where he spends his nights.
Yeah.
Right.
Poor guy.
So, as we see in verse 19, Leah once again conceives yet again and bears him a sixth son. And God has endowed me with a good dowry. Now my husband will honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. And so it does seem in the end that she still wants his attention. It's the one thing she doesn't have.
Or his status.
Or his status, right. And then in verse 21, we get one last child from Leah. We don't get a naming convention, but it's kind of assumed because she has a daughter. Dinah will come into play later, but this is kind of her introduction on the scene. Dinah is Leah's last child and is a daughter. Like, good heavens, they have all these sons and one girl. But then in verse 22, God remembered Rachel, and God heeded her and opened her womb. She conceived and bore a son, and she said, God has taken away my reproach. And so she names him Joseph, saying, may the Lord add to me another son. So by the end of this, Rachel finally gets a baby herself.
But the first part of 22, then God remembered Rachel. I mean, after 6 sons and a daughter were born, and the maids in waiting children, it's about time God paid some attention to Rachel. But again, it's another instance of God controlling the fertility of these patriarchs and their wives, and who will conceive and who will not.
Right.
So I just kind of feel sorry for Rachel, who wanted, a child so badly, and she's watching this all happen around her. And, she's been denied up until now. So I'm glad she has a son, even though it's Joseph.
Mm-hmm. So she's kind of humbled in a way that she was made to wait till last. Like, she has all of her husband's affection and attention, and status is given to all the women in her life first. And when they're wrapped up having children is when she finally gets hers.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the other young men are teenagers by now. Mm-hmm. And old enough to be looking for, wives of themselves. They married young. So here comes this little baby of hers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'm kind of projecting into the story, about Technicolor Dreamcoat and being sent to Egypt, or running to Egypt and all that. But being the youngest child, usually that child is kind of pampered and favored and whatever. And I can see the older boys being resentful of this, because now their mother, if she had any status, has lost it.
Right. Yeah. Going forward, Joseph and the Technicolor Dreamcoat is a very well-known story. So we kind of know, especially where this one's going. But it plays a huge factor that Joseph is the youngest by far. There's a big age gap between him and Reuben. Mm-hmm. And he is so young children, they often get a little bit pampered. The older ones get the strictest rules, and things slowly loosen up after that. But it's also the only son of the favorite wife.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's always important to keep in mind, that like, not only is this the youngest, but this is Rachel's son.
Yep.
So what do we think about baby mania? And kind of one of the questions we asked at the beginning of the hour was, is this descriptive for women struggling with fertility and just them making sense? Or how do we feel about, like, God kind of in this situation is more puppeteer than we've seen God be in a little bit. In like some of the stories, there's much more like puppeteer, but this kind of understanding that God's pulling the strings and creating the dynamics, and in some ways ramping up the rivalry between these women.
Yep.
So how do you understand the dynamics here? Like what do you see in this story about how God is described as being active in their lives?
Well, if the purpose of the writer is to provide a story that has some meaning other than the facts. I mean, the facts are just there to further the message that the writer wants to tell his listeners, more of that old, it's, it may not be what really happened, but we've got to have a good story, a moral. We've got to have something that describes how we developed and so forth. That would be, you wonder when it says, oh, all of a sudden God remembered Rachel. Hey, this is the omnipotent sort of person. What did he do? He forgot about her? I mean, come on.
Yeah, so one of the common beliefs that I hear a lot of is I think we very much hold God to be an all-knowing, all-loving God, and yet this doesn't feel like there's the moment where it's like God remembers, which I think is more like God turned attention. Like there's ways you could explain it. It's a common phrase of like God remembered, kind of like God remembered Noah. What was the other one? God remember. I think there's a point where it says God remembers Abraham, which is kind of like God took care of them. And so there's this.
I was just going to say another way to say that phrase that would be God turned his focus on the next person or whatever.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But there's also a sense that like trying to make this be an all-loving God, there's a certain point where I know for me this feels meddlesome, not loving, unless you're looking like is there a certain point where God is loving and not kind? Are these people kind of pawns in a story to get the story to where it needs to go?
Oh, yes, yeah. Right.
Like, how do we feel if we see a story of like God interacting with us in a way that it's like, well, God may put us through some trials that won't make our life nice, but will move the plot along. I think that puts us in an uncomfortable spot if we start to assert that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and we talked earlier about God knowing, all loving, omnipresent, and whether that was a New Testament concept or whether it actually was active in the Old Testament stories, because God seems to be physically present in so many of the stories.
Mm-hmm.
So I question whether the all-knowing, I'm gonna concede on the all-knowing. I think there's a master plan going on here. But all loving and all okay, that's where my mind is, that some of this is New Testament theology that we're trying to apply here.
I think that's a great observation is, there's assumptions that we have that they don't necessarily, which is always good to keep in mind. So if we put ourselves in more of the worldview at the time, does it make it easier or harder to cope with the hard things in life if we know that there's a potential that God will put us through something that is not fun, uncomfortable, unpleasant, hard, for the benefit, not necessarily of our own story, but for capital T, the story. Is that comforting or is that discouraging if we're involved with the greater story, but that means we're going to face some things that move the overall plot along, even if it's uncomfortable for us?
Mhm.
I think it was uncomfortable for them, and yes, he was moving the plot along. Applying it to us, I have a hard time with that because I don't believe God does bad things to us on purpose.
Okay.
And, so I have a conflict there between what's happening to them versus what I believe God's role is in my life now.
Okay.
Mhm. It is a way of explaining why bad things happen to good people.
Mhm. Yeah.
That's a whole other discussion.
It sure
Indeed, yeah.
is. Uh,
Yeah. So I was thinking about this because I know, so the question of like who has responsibility, and I like some of the question of like who has action and agency in this story.
Mm.
Because
God.
we see different people have different responses to the whole thing and why things are happening. And there's a certain point where I have a lot of sympathy for Rachel, if only because it's not her fault that she's the beloved wife. That's something happening to her. She has her husband's affection, and that is squarely on the shoulders of Jacob and how Jacob treats the two women. And yet she is bearing the effects of God blessing Leah because Jacob isn't affectionate towards her. And I do think that there are things in life that we bear the brunt of, even if it's caused by someone else's reaction or actions. And we see that Rachel is grappling with something that is happening in her world, not because of anything she's doing. I mean, she does take action where she can with the mandrake roots. But that's to me where this passage becomes more than just like a funny story about family drama. Is not everything in our life is our fault.
Oh, that's
And
true.
and yet we still have to deal with the actions and consequences that other people in our lives. And the question of how do we respond when we face the consequences of other people's decisions.
Mhm, mhm. Well, you can broaden that in all sorts of scenarios. First thing that comes to mind is a drunk driver hitting a young family and killing them all. I mean, somebody else's decision causes disastrous outcomes, whatever. But I mean, you could play that scenario out hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times with different cause and effect here.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that Rachel wasn't loved by Jacob? I mean, I don't see anything here that indicates that he treated her any differently from the other one. Her only fault was she didn't have any kids, and of course she says it's Jacob's fault, and Jacob says it's God's fault. It certainly isn't his.
Right.
Jacob does actively hate Leah, though.
Wow. Why?
No
What-
examples are given, but the word hate is used a couple times.
It's used in reference to Leah.
Yeah, to Leah. But I mean, that's something that Jacob is doing. We see the negative to Leah, and then the flip side of that is, you know, that Rachel is loved. So, you know, one is hated, therefore, you know, the other is loved, but there are no examples given. It's just an assumption.
So this is actually kind of what we're talking about. I think is sometimes helpful when thinking about other family politics. One of the things being, you're not given a choice of who your parents are. You're not given a choice of how you were raised. Those are things that happen to you. And I know that in my own experience, my parents tried very hard to treat my sister and I equally, and it was unequal anyways. And there were times where my sister felt hated, even if my parents were trying to treat us equally. And there are sometimes dynamics that form that, like, I think family scenarios are, I mean, looking into a window because we don't get to choose our family. And yet we bear the effects of the choices of our family still.
Did that cause friction between you and your sister?
At times, yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things was that, like, I was a really good student because I saw how my sister didn't, there was other dynamics. My sister was bullied a lot and it affected her grades, but my parents didn't notice that the grades were affected to the bullying. And so I just ended up the star child. And she resented me for a while for being Mrs. Perfect. But it was one of those things that, like, even when you try to raise kids the same way, you never raise the same child twice or the same way. It's not possible. Everyone has their own struggles. And so, yeah, thinking about it, I mean, especially as we're approaching Thanksgiving and, like, people are at the table again, and we have all these dynamics come right back out.
Yeah.
And so the question returns of, like, or I guess lingers, we don't have to answer it, of, like, what agency do we have in a situation where we don't make all the decisions, where we're having to respond to family, and that family isn't, there are these dynamics.
But they're universal dynamics. I mean,
Yeah, they are.
This is true of any family you want to pick. You're just talking about degree. How bad is it?
I have to believe that Rachel suffered as these boys grew up. You know, they're probably good strapping boys, you know, for what the future holds for them. But, you know, they're definitely in favor of their own mother. And like, I could see that Hagar intentionally made Sarah's life miserable. I think in some ways these boys could have really targeted Rachel too and made it extremely uncomfortable for her during all these years.
Yeah, and those boys will make her life worse because they, well, we will get to Joseph and his dream coat a little bit later, but we see the effect that, yeah, the sons do have a dramatic effect. I mean, you can imagine what's going on with Rachel. But yeah, family dynamics, I feel like no matter what side, if you relate more to being a Rachel or a Leah, or maybe you like, people relate to the handmaidens that are kind of just like not the focus of attention, but still there and kind of that middle child feeling. There's pain on all sides of this. And I think it's always good to pull out that every family has struggles. Every family will end up with painful moments. I don't think you can go through life and not have some of this. And so the question is always, where's our agency and how do we respond? Because if you can't control what's happening to you, what you control is your response. And what I see in this story is that the sisters weren't able to find a way to come together and kind of.
Well, go ahead. To kind of
no,
what?
no,
To
no,
make
I'm
it up.
done. Go for it.
Okay, well, I'm looking at Leah right now, and except for the love of Jacob, she had everything. And, in a lot of marriages, people get to the point of, well, I'm moving on. I'm giving up trying so hard after all these years. I can't do anything to change a situation. Then I'm just simply going to do with, my sons and I'm just going to, you can have him. I've got the children. And she doesn't seem to do that. It's like for her, nothing is ever enough. Yeah, so, I don't know. I sympathize with Rachel, but I want Leah to just move on. So,
Do you know people like that in life who it seems like no matter how much they have, there's always that one thing that they're still chasing?
and it's usually an intangible, like somebody's love or power or success or money,
Yeah.
And if you get enough of one, you can decide maybe you can do without the other.
Yeah. In the end, I think that's why some of these stories are so powerful and we return to them again and again, is we read them and we know the person, we know the archetype. We've all met the Leah in life who it's like, she seems like she has everything and yet she's still so unhappy. And you gotta wonder why.
Yeah. From the whole 7 years when he was working for Laban, earning the right to marry Rachel. I mean, I can see Leah being very active and trying to change his mind all those years. And she's been at this since Jacob walked in their door. And how many years have gone by with this, where she just has not given up this dream that he will turn to her and she will be number one. It's like, come on, get over it and move on.
All right. Well, we are past the hour. Thanks for sticking with me with this.
Jacob couldn't love two women.
Next week, we're gonna finish, or let's see, next week is the first of, I'm forgetting. Is next week the first week? No, we have one more week in November. Okay. So next week we're gonna finish out the chapter and we are going to talk about Jacob's side of things, and when the women are dealing with baby madness, he's dealing with his own drama. So gonna round out the family situation. And so the story continues. But can I pray us out for today?
Okay. Afterwards, can you just leave it on for a sec? I have a question for Joe.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thanks.
All right, let us pray. Good and gracious God, as it becomes the holiday season, we're both excited for the joy of the season and for all the festivities it brings, and yet we also know that for a lot of people, it brings up old rivalries and sometimes unhealed wounds and dynamics that never seem to go away. We ask that you be with us through all of these things, whether it be the struggles of sickness affecting our communities, whether it be travel, or whether it's just old dynamics that are still playing a hand in our lives. Help us think about the ways we respond and empower us to respond in ways that heal instead of building up walls and making situations worse. Give us the compassion to know when it is our time to act and when it is our time to just simply reflect on what's happening around us. So specifically though, I ask that for this group that you grant healing and safety for all of us, as we know that both COVID and colds and the flu are going around. So keep them safe, keep them healthy, and be with us as we do enter this holiday season until we're able to gather again next week. I pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you, Chris, again.
Thank you,
Thank
Chris.
you. Happy Thanksgiving.
Good to see you all.
Yes,
Yes.
happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yeah.